Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 57. And today I'm joined by Jamie Taylor, who you may know from what was called the .NET Core podcast and is now recently being rebranded to the Modern .NET Show. And we don't really have we're just saying before recording, we don't have a specific agenda or topic today. We're just going to geek out on podcasting and .NET and things. So welcome to the show, Jamie. Great to have you on.
Hey, well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for making the offer to have me on the show. I know that we chatted on my show a while back, and it's great to be able to sort of, I can't think of the right words, but return the favor, be on the other side of the mic.
Yeah, flip the tables. I don't know. It's kind of
flip the bit. That's it.
Yes, that'll do. So for those that don't know you already, could you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure, yeah. So I, as Dan said earlier on, I'm Jamie Taylor. I'm one of those Microsoft MVPs that people warn you off about. I'm also, you can't see it because you're listening to this, but I also am the podcasting champion. This is a pro wrestling belt that my brother had made for me, and it has like all of the logos for the podcasts on it. I'll get a picture for the show notes, or I'll find a tweet where I've tweeted at me holding it, if you like. That's a silly thing I like to do. And yeah, I've been in the .NET space for, my degree was in .NET. I started my comp sci degree in 2004, and they were like, you're going to need to know this .NET stuff. So we'll teach you computer science, but use .NET to do it. And so quite literally, I've been in the .NET space since then. I'd played around with it a little bit before then, but yeah, I've been in the .NET space since then. And, we're in around 2016 when there was this chat of, hey, what's next for .NET? Well, we're coming up with this thing called .NET vNext. And I started watching these, I think they were called the ASP.NET Core community stand-ups with, Scott Hanselman, Scott Hunter, Damien Edwards and people like that. I was like, hey, this seems really, really interesting. And a friend of mine had challenged me to come up with some kind of technical blog at that time. So I was like, you know what? Why don't I write about this .NET vNext? And that became a project that I did for 2 years, where I was like, every week, without fail for 2 weeks, there was a new blog post on a Friday, but it was like 2,000, 3,000 words plus, and a code sample to talk about what I'd built. But what was great about that was that I would turn up to work, and then like over lunch, I'd go out for lunch and come back, and I would see like my website on 5 different screens as I walked back into the office. I was like, oh, cool. You all already did this thing. That's cool. So you'll all be using that next week then. But the thing I didn't like about it was, and I'm a dreadful writer. I would bellyache over, is this a comma? Should that be a semicolon? Should that be a full stop? And to the point where I would be on the train into work with my laptop open going, wait, hang on. This was supposed to go out 3 hours ago. Should that be a full stop? Should that be a comma? I don't know. And so, and then my brother said to me, hey, I've got this Blue Yeti I'm not doing anything with anymore. Do you think you might use it? And I'm like, cool, I'll plug it into the computer and see what I can do. So I plugged it in and I was like, wait, I could turn a few of these into monologues. So, and the story of how I created the .NET Core podcast was essentially, I've told it several times, essentially I took the laptop to local multinational branded coffee shop. I'm trying to advertise for them, but went there, ordered myself one of those silly coffees that have 1,000,001 different ingredients, and that went cold because I just opened up a text file. I was like, right, episode 1 will be this, episode 2 will be this, episode 3 will be this, and I planned out about 15 episodes, and they were all just bullet points. And then when it came around to writing those, because initially it was a monologue show, when it came around to writing those, I'd take one of those bullet points, turn it into a paragraph. And it turned out that I had way more information than I could put into a 10-15 minute, because what I wanted was 10-15 minute knowledge drops. Just like, oh cool, this is what ASP.NET is, and this is how it relates to ASP.NET Core. Yeah, I wrote a whole bunch of those. I've only ever released about 6 of them. And then it became an interview show. People started reaching out to me and was like, can I be on your show talking about .NET Core? I was like, sure. I mean, I don't know how to do interviews, so I had to learn how to do interviews very quickly. But luckily, I'd been listening to loads of podcasts for years anyway, so I was kind of learning it by osmosis. And what I did was I just went back to a few of my favorite episodes of those interview shows and sat and listened and tried to critically listen. What is it that they are doing? How is it that it's presented? and which things do I like about these, and what can I emulate or borrow? I wasn't stealing. What can I borrow from each from the person's style? And that, as of the date of recording, that was 6.5 years ago. And I think we're on episode 133 or something like that. So it's been going, a while.
Yeah, that is very impressive. I think it was when I looked on your website, it was just under 130, but I guess you've kind of recorded some as well that haven't been released yet.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, and you've got a bunch of other podcasts as well, like Tabs and Spaces and all that kind of thing. I don't know how you find time. I struggle with one, let alone a whole bunch.
Well, I think it's because I hire an editor, right? I used to edit all myself for like the first year or so. And then I was like, this is laborious and time consuming. And I realized at that point something that I've only come back to recently. I was recently reading this book. What is it? 10x is easier than 2x is the name of the book, and it talks about how it's actually easier to do more effective work than it is to just a little bit. So, like if you're operating at 1x and you want to operate twice as produce twice as much, that's actually harder to do than producing 10 times as much. Because what they say is that you apply the Pareto principle. You realize that 100% of the effort you only require actually 20% of the effort to actually reach that point. And so what you can do is you can hyper focus on the 20% that you're brilliant at and hire other people to do those other 80%. They call them the who's. So you hire a who to do that. So, in my instance, I've, for the last couple of years, I've had an editor, right? And I guess I could, if I really desperately wanted to, hire like a virtual assistant to figure out guests. But I'm quite lucky in that people reach out to me. They're like, hey, can I talk about this on your show? I'm like, absolutely. I totally need someone to talk about that. Let's talk about that. And I could hire social media people and stuff like that. But I'm quite happy with just sort of releasing the episodes and letting it just sit there and percolate itself. But if I really wanted to take it super seriously, that's what I could do. But yeah, I realized quite early on that if I'm doing, and this is a quote from the book, but it's also from Mr. Beast, Jimmy Donaldson, and that is, if you're doing 5 jobs, you can only really give 20% of your time to any one of those jobs. Whereas if you take one of those jobs and give it to someone else, you've got another 20% that you can devote to something else. And that's what I've been trying to do, just progressively offload my my sort of day-to-day tasks to other people. You see this a lot with like a friend of mine, Luce. She talks about how she hired someone to do some of the housework for her, just because then it frees up an hour, 2 hours of her time every week, and it means that she can take care of the things that are not as important to her, right? So like maybe taking time out to go for a walk and take care of her mental fitness is a little bit more important than making sure that the bed is made in the morning. You know what I mean? To her, that's more important. And so that's why she's hired a who to take care of that 20% of her day-to-day task, or 5% or whatever. So then she can devote her energy to something else. And yeah, that quote, I only read it a few weeks back, but it kind of stuck with me that, if you've got 5 tasks, you can only really devote 20% of your time to any one of those tasks. And I've taken that to into my practice as a developer as well. I'm like, right, okay, here is the stuff I need to do. And to be 100% effective, I always try to focus on effectiveness rather than productivity. We're going in like a huge tangent already, so I do apologize about that. But to focus on the effectiveness, I need to be able to drop certain tasks. So, for instance, answering emails. I don't do it. Not during work hours, because it's going to get in the way of, if I stop what I'm doing and go answer an email, it's going to take me 15 minutes, 20 minutes to get back to where I was, right? Because all of that context of the code I was working on and the problem I was solving and maybe the libraries I was using, or, all of that stuff is gone. I've got to relearn all of that. It's not learning, but I've got to put it back into my brain to build up that context again. And so I just don't answer emails during the day. If it's an important email from someone, then they know what to put in it to get through my mental filter. But I just don't, because it's just not worth my time during the day. Now, what I do is when I finish my day, I'll turn the computer off or whatever. I'll go do some relaxing thing, which I can talk about later if you like. And then I give myself half an hour of, right, before everybody gets home, before dinner happens, before chill out time in the evening, half an hour of 100% focus on all of the emails you missed during the day, and then that seems to work for me, because then I can look at the work, because I can focus on the work that I'm doing throughout the day and not have to have that 15-minute break every time an important, hopefully you can hear the bunny quotes there, every time one of those important emails comes through, I'm not losing 15 minutes. I'm dealing with every single one of them, and it's taking me maybe 30 seconds to a minute at the end of each day. That was just me going on a bit of a random tangent about like how I organize parts of my day. But yes, you're right. There are other podcasts that I'm part of, and the way that we're able to do all of those other ones is because I have that editor. Just because I'm like, you know how like we're in the old days of developing software, we used to write some code and then throw it over the wall to QA. I kind of do that, right? I do the recording as best I can with all of the bits of equipment that I have, because obviously the highest quality audio, garbage in is garbage out, right? So you need to provide the highest quality sort of recordings. I do that, and then quite literally throw it over the wall to my editor and say, this is vaguely what I want, do it. And then like leave him to be a little bit creative in how he handles things. And because of that, I'm able to do the Modern.NET Show, which is my main one, which is about .NET. It used to be called .NET Core Podcast, but then Microsoft rebranded to just .NET, and everyone got really confused. Well, if it's .NET, then what's this thing for 20 years ago called .NET? Well, it was never actually called .NET. It was always called .NET Framework. But we're known as .NET developers because they didn't want to say .NET Framework developer. Whatever. And so what I've noticed in the last maybe 6 months is that this term modern.NET has been sort of bandied around by parts of the community. So I'm like, that's it. That's the show. Modern.NET. Because then it gives you that hit of, oh, well, this is what's modern about .NET. Well, let me tell you, right? So I could do that one. I've also got a video game podcast called Waffling Tailors. That is just me and my brother just talking nonsense about video games. We sometimes cover movies that are based on video games. We sometimes cover events that are happening. We try to stick away from the news because by the time we've released it, it's old, right? But we also like do the occasional conversation with a developer, or like a designer, or like we've got some gaming legends that we've talked to. We talked to Greg Barnett, who was the director and writer of the Discworld games. We talked to Stu Cambridge, who worked on Cannon Fodder and is actually in the intro to Cannon Fodder. You know, we got a couple of people like that. So that's that one. And then there's Tabs and Spaces, which is just like technology agnostic software development advice. And it's called Tabs and Spaces because quite literally there's no point in arguing over whether you should use tabs or spaces. You just turn on the linter and then git commit from there, right? So it really doesn't matter unless you're in Python. It really doesn't matter. And so we argue about the stupid stuff so you don't have to, right? So like there was an episode where we argued about buy versus build, and for both sides, what's kind of important, or because every podcast has to have an episode about imposter syndrome. We had an episode about imposter syndrome, and because all three of us work alongside a lot of juniors and people right at the beginning of their career, we had an episode about what to do about job interviews. Like you get your first job interview, what do? How do you dress? Do you arrive early? Do you arrive late? How do you prepare for it? And it was in that podcast episode that I announced that I sometimes listen to Danger Zone on the way into an interview, just because it like gets me going. I'm like, yeah, okay, And so yeah, that's a really long answer, but yes, there are 3 podcasts that I appear on.
I think you've answered every single question I could possibly ask. I found it quite when you were talking about the productivity stuff. It did feel like weird. Flip. What was the term we used before? Flip the bit, because obviously my episode on your show was about developer productivity, so it's very similar kind of thing. But yeah, it's quite. I know when when you do read business or entrepreneurial kind of books and that kind of thing, a big part of it is the struggle that people have to let go of stuff that they used to do themselves and hand over. I don't know, I'm certainly in that boat, because I would feel really, there's some things I'll be happy to hand over, but editing the podcast, I don't know, for me it's a bit personal, but it would certainly, as you say, it's very laborious, and that's a large part of it, because people ask me to be on the show and I've got a massive Notion backlog. So actually that isn't hard at all. So most of the time is the editing, but I don't know. I quite enjoy it, but yeah, it just gets a bit laborious. But I think I would struggle to hand it over, I think.
Sure, totally, yeah. Like I said, mine was just because I had the 3 and I was like, you know what? I'd like some free time, because it was a case of finish work for the day, do the email thing, have dinner, and do evening stuff, just chilling with folks. And then it'd be like, right, it's 10 o'clock. I've got 2 hours. I will work on a podcast episode and just edit it down. Whereas actually, My editor is able to, he doesn't give me your full 8 hours a day because he works on other people's shows, but he's able to give me that solid block of time where he can devote 100% of his attention to that. Whereas, 10 o'clock at night, I'm like, okay, I'm falling asleep now. Whereas, and that's where some of the flubs and the issues came through and all that kind of stuff. So fully appreciate it. But for me, it made sense.
Maybe I do need to do that. So apart from editing in your podcasting journey, what would you say some of the really, really big challenge? Is there one big challenge or something that you faced that has really stood out?
So I will use the phrase that my friend Steve Worthy uses, and that's GAS. So gear acquisition syndrome, the shiny thing, shiny object syndrome.
Oh, right? I know that one. If you looked at my desk, you'd know I know that one.
And especially when you're getting into podcasting or content creation or video creation or anything like that, it is so easy to just go, you know what, I'll buy all the things because obviously it's 200 quid, it's $200. It must be the best top of the line thing and it will work for me and it will be the best. Problem is, different microphones react differently to how your voice works, what your room is like, and all that kind of stuff. So you need to, and then once you've got the microphone sorted, maybe you need a cloud lifter. Or maybe you need to use XLR versus USB, and maybe you need a recording, a piece of recording hardware, like a Rodecaster or a Zoom. Different to the Zoom video conferencing stuff, this is a piece of hardware. Also different to Zoom Platform, which is a video game publishing company. And then you're right, I've got all this audio, now what do I do with it? I need to buy loads of plugins, you really don't. I often tell people that and now it won't sound great, but most laptops have a built-in mic that will be good enough for you to actually record something with to see whether you want to do it, right? I've known so many people who've dropped 300, 400, 500 pounds or dollars or whatever on bits of hardware and they never actually gotten to recording because they're well, I don't know I haven't written anything, I haven't got a plan, I'm just going to hit record, and then they get 10 minutes in and go, actually, this isn't for me. And at that point, they've spent all this money and got all this hardware that's just going to sit there and do nothing. So I have to tell people, come up with an idea like I did. You don't have to be exactly like me, but, go somewhere where you were separate from everyone else, write up a whole bunch of ideas, and then come back and record a bunch directly into your laptop. Even if you have to sit with your face right on the keyboard so that it's picking it up properly, do that, right? Because then you've got this raw audio to work with and play with. Because, I went through that position myself. I had the Blue Yeti that I'd gotten for free from my brother, and then I bought a Samsung Q2U, which worked fine, except it was a dynamic, I think. There's two types of microphones, a condenser and a dynamic, and I constantly forget which one's which. But it was the one that didn't work for me because of the room I'm in. And so it would pick up all of the background noise, and it would amplify all the background noise, so then I was having to shout to cut through it.
That'll be a condenser.
There you go then, right? Yeah. See?
I've gone through the same journey. So I started with the Blue Yeti as well. And you can see my room, the listeners can't, but it's it's a small box, so it's very echoey. And the condenser, as you say, picks up everything. And the Blue Yeti is a condenser. And it's called an active microphone, so it's constantly listening. Where I've switched, and I can see that you've switched to a dynamic microphone, which you've got to be much more close. If I kind of back away, you can hear that going quieter and quieter. So you've got to be quite close. But it also means you don't get as much room echo and that kind of thing. So it's much better for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I always tell people, get some audio to play with first, right? Because even if it's just you talking about whatever, right? Just reading the phone book or whatever, because then you can get an idea of what the editing process is like. And that's the problem, is that I see folks go and spend loads of money on loads of different bits of hardware and software and stuff, and they never produce anything. And I'm like, that's great for the economy, not so great for you, because you've got all this stuff you're never going to use, right? And it's the same with when the big names got into video game streaming on Twitch or code streaming on Twitch, I saw loads of people get started with that and then drop off immediately because, it looks easy, right? You just push a button and go live, and you don't. Well, actually, no, you've got to be producing something and interacting with people and, be a warm, approachable personality and have something to say and something to do.
So that's where I've been going wrong.
Yeah, right? That's where I've been going wrong for sure. But yeah, it's difficult, and gas is the beginning and end of it. And so, like I said, I always tell people just use the mic built into your laptop. And if you are a Mac person and you have a relatively new MacBook or a MacBook Air, the microphones built into your laptop are supposed to be studio quality. So you can just literally, I think they're dynamics as well. So you'd have to put your head right up against a keyboard for it to pick it up properly. But you can just use that just to get started. And, you don't need to go and buy expensive headphones. I've got a pair of bone conduction ones that are Bluetooth, just because I prefer to have my ears open so that I can hear things around me. There you go. You see, so Dan's got a pair that are exactly the same. Yeah. Mine are the Aftershocks. What are they? I can't remember what they are, but they're Aftershocks something or other.
Mine are Aftershocks too. I can't see a brand on mine. I'm not. For the listeners can't see obviously, but I'm not using it at the moment. But I do use it quite often, for the gym and stuff, and it's really good.
Yeah. Well, I ended up getting mine because, unfortunately, I used to get a lot of outer ear infections, which is the ear canal on the outside. And that was literally because, water and moisture was getting trapped in there. And then I was putting cans over my ears. So then it couldn't evaporate out. It couldn't get out. And the infections happen when the water that's in there goes bad. So if you've got headphones on for several hours a day, it's going to get a bit funky, right? So you got to wash it out or whatever. And so I've got these just for similar reasons, right? I'll go for a walk or I'll go for a run or, this past week I've been doing loads of yoga in the morning. That's really good because I've got the app on my phone. I can just plonk it down. I've got the headphones on. I can hear if someone knocks on the door, or I can hear if something else happens, right? Or if I'm doing something, if someone else is doing something in the house, then they can still shout for me, "Hey, Jamie, come check this out." I go, "Oh, right, cool, yeah, pause." And there's a play pause button, so I can just hit the pause button, go and do the thing, come back, right? I can hear them. But also, I feel safer when I'm outside. If I'm going for a run and I've got the big cans on and they're noise cancelling and I can't hear anything and I'm running along maybe a track and a car comes or a bicycle comes, there's literally no way for me to tell unless they're in front of me. Whereas with these bone conduction ones, because it leaves my ear canals open, I can hear them. It means that the audio quality isn't brilliant, but that's because you've got sound coming in from the world. But that's fine, because I only ever listen to podcasts, so...
They're not actually that bad, to be honest, given what they are, and they don't go in your ears. They're not too bad. Mm-hmm. They're perfect for podcasts. But most of the time while I'm working, I do wear the big cans because, for the opposite reason, I don't want to be hearing people in the house. I've got two kids, and it's nice to be able to just put them on. I think when we're talking on your podcast about developer productivity, one of the things I mentioned was, for me, having big headphones that go over your ears kind of really helped me stay in the zone, because I just feel a lot more, all encompassed, I guess, and that really helped me focus, even if I'm not listening to music.
Yeah, no, I get that. Just sort of putting them on. It's kind of so to go on a bit of a tangent, but I'll come back to it in a minute. I've been working, remotely for 5-6 years now. And what I found was I was having trouble separating work Jamie from home Jamie, right? And it would be really difficult because I'd get up, do the whole bathroom thing, do the whole breakfast thing, and then everyone would leave the house, and I'd go, right, okay, I'll go sit in my workspace and get on with work. But I was still at home, right? And then when I finish work, okay, so I've closed the laptop, I've closed the computer, it's all off. I'll go into one of the other rooms, hang out with everybody there. I'm still in the same building that I did my work with. And there was this wonderful piece of advice by Scott Hanselman about 4 years ago, where he said what he does, and he's quite lucky in that he's worked remotely for Microsoft for pretty much his whole career at Microsoft. And I think that's because he lives in Portland but reports to the Seattle office, which is quite a distance away, right? So the commute would be several, maybe half a day or something like that. I don't know. What he does is he will walk out of the house and he'll walk around his block clockwise, and then go back into the house. When he walks into the house, he's done his commute. He's gotten into that headspace of, now I'm going into the office. And then when he finishes for the day, even if everyone's at home, it's the middle of summer, all the kids are home, his wife's home, whatever, he still closes everything down, leaves the house, and then walks the opposite way around the block, right? And comes back into the house. Because then he's commuted home. In the same way that, in the before times, before we were all grounded and sent to our rooms, I tend not to talk about the events that happened. I tend to use those metaphors. We would drive to work. We would get a train to work. We'd get a bus to work. We would travel to work. Then when we're done, we would travel home. Well, a lot of people missed that when they were in this working from home or remote working or hybrid working environment. And just like what you were saying about you put the headphones on, you're then in workspace, right? That's what I started doing. I started taking these little walks, and it is maybe a 5-minute walk. It's not a great deal. And, weather like today where I am, it's, raining and it's windy and it's dreadful, but it still puts me in that place of I'm going to work. And so, yeah, I totally get the put the headphones on and I'm in workspace. I get that because, you're saying, maybe it cuts out all the noise and you can focus on, it's almost like putting, are they called blinkers that they put onto, or blinders, I guess, that they put onto horses? They can only see in front of them. Same thing, right? I can only see the task in front of me.
For that blinker stuff, another thing I find that's quite useful sometimes is, because I've actually got 3 monitors here, turning off 2 of the monitors, and so I've only got one, because otherwise I don't have something, Teams or something distracting me on one. I don't do it all the time, but sometimes if I try and be aware of what my focus level is whilst I'm working, and if I find that, because obviously that varies, and if I find that I'm not as focused as I want to be, I really need to do this thing, then just turning off the monitors can really help. But yeah, for me, I think, because I've started recently, about 6 months now, going to the gym every day in the morning, and I time it so that when I get back, that's when I'm starting work. So that's kind of my round the block. And also we tend to have stand-ups at 9:15. So I aim to get back just before then. I've got time to grab a coffee and I have protein shakes after the gym. So get both of those, sit down, and I time it so that's when I start the stand-up. And because that's a team meeting, that's kind of like an enforced start of the day, and then I'm in work mode. But yeah. So we're going to pause the conversation just for a moment for a quick mention about our awesome new sponsor, Track.js, who are helping support the show so I can continue to create lots of episodes. We've spoken a lot before in this podcast about back-end monitoring and telemetry, but what about the front end? Do you know what happens when your JavaScript breaks? I mean, I personally never write bugs, but sometimes browsers are weird and users do unexpected things, and we get errors in the production UI. Do you know when that happens? I've got to be honest, for a lot of my projects, I wouldn't. Well, Track.js is a fantastic tool that monitors errors from your end users, showing you a story of exactly what happened that led to that error. It gives you actionable observability to what's happening in the client side. So check it out at trackjs.com. Just thinking about your podcast and 130 odd episodes, are there any guests or topics or episodes that have stood out to you as being maybe your favorite episodes or that kind of thing?
That's a difficult one, right? Because now I'm thinking, well, who's going to be listening to this? I better not say, this is the best. But I think, my friend James introduced me to Richard Campbell, and that was amazing. I did a whole hour and a bit with him. We were talking about his, at the time he was writing, I think he's finished writing the book, but he's just sort of figuring out editing and typeface and stuff. He was at the time writing a book about the history of .NET, and he'd gone and interviewed people from Microsoft all the way back to the early 90s, because there's, a lot of people may not know that even though .NET Framework was officially released in 2001, 2002, there was about 10 years of run-up to it, right? There's loads of stuff happening. And, you have to kind of talk about Java, even though a lot of people don't like to talk about Java when they talk about C#. You kind of have to talk about that. So as far as I'm aware, using the knowledge that I had in that episode when I talked to Richard, it starts in the sort of early 90s and builds up to that. But I also talked to him about, because he is at the level that he is, right? What would be his advice to someone who's maybe younger than him, getting to his, or early in their career, getting to his stages and things like, do you metaphorically hold hands with someone when they're about to make a mistake? And he says that I will show you where the cliff edge is, but if you want to drive over it, that's totally on you, right? I'll show you where it is. I'll show you what will happen if you drive over, but you may need to make that mistake so that then next time you won't drive over the edge. And I think that was just so powerful, because I had spent a lot of time with juniors leading up to that doing the exact opposite, right? Where I'd be like, I'm going to put things in place so that you can't break things. And the problem with that is that we learn by breaking things, right? And so some of my work with apprentices and juniors and stuff like that since then has been, okay, here's the edge that you can drive off. Here is the problem that will happen if you drive off the edge. But if you want to do that, totally. But you're in a position where if you do, nothing will break, right? You can't bring down a production system or whatever. And I feel like we need to work like that as developers going forward, right? I know that a lot of companies already do that, and a lot of development houses already do that. But like, if I from my computer can do drop tables on production, that's a big problem. Not because I did it, but because I had the ability to do it, right? No one should have access to production. No one should be able to get onto the production box and delete all of the binaries. And so I go in and I put into place things where you can't do that, right? Well, I need to be able to do that. Well, why? Talk me through why you need to be able to access the production system. Oh, well, because we do this. Okay, right. Here's the new modern paradigm of how you do that. And this is how maybe you're using a GitHub action and you're pushing out to a Kubernetes, or you're pushing out to like a Docker container registry, and then your application is then told that there is a new container, and your Kubernetes cluster will slowly start replacing all of the containers one by one as their request levels go down, so that then you get that eventual push to live, rather than log on to a server using FTP, use shift and delete to permanently delete something, and then copy pasting it on, because then you've literally no way to get back to where you were. Whereas if something fails with a deploy to production, you can push a button and deploy it back to how it was, right? And that's the great thing about computers, is that if you write a script for it to follow, it will follow it to the letter. Whereas if you give a human a script, sometimes they don't. Or sometimes they get distracted, or sometimes their phone rings, or sometimes someone taps them on the shoulder and says, would you like to come and get a cup of coffee? Or sometimes, something bad happens and they need to have 5 minutes to go and, have some fresh air or something, right? Or sometimes it happens and they need to take a break. So what's great about deploying to these production environments, especially for people who are more junior than me, is that they can't mess it up, right? You can show them what happens when it messes up, but then you say, look, this isn't going to happen. I will spin up an environment for you over here that's like a sandpit, that if you want to break, here is how we used to do it. You can see how we used to do it. And this is why we now do it this way. And so I think there's a really long rambly answer, but I think the episode with Richard Campbell was one of my favorites. And I also interviewed Nick Craver at the time of Stack Overflow about how it's all on one server. Like, everything is all on one machine. And I understood about 15% of what he said in that episode.
Yeah, it's funny when you were saying about... So one of my favourite episodes of both yours and mine, and what you were saying then about you shouldn't be able to break things, was actually a topic that came up with this, is the episode with Iris Klassen, with her book, The Copy and Paste Developer. I think she was on your show first, and I think I was laughing throughout that. That was one of my favourite episodes. So then I asked her onto this show, and it was very similar. She's such a good person to get on with. But yeah, one of the topics was, and one of the things that's covered in her, so her book's fictional, but it's about software developers. In her book was that whole thing where accidentally breaking something, but you shouldn't be able to. It's a business thing. But yeah, that was quite a fun episode. And then with Richard Campbell as well, he's not been on this show, but I did meet him, I can't remember what year it was now. It was quite a few years ago. You know Steve Gordon?
Mm-hmm.
So he's, I don't think he runs it anymore, but he used to run a user group down in Brighton in the UK. And he had an all-day hackathon, and Richard Campbell was there, and then Richard Campbell did a talk about his book and the history of .NET there. So I was I went down and spent the day there doing the hackathon and attended the meetup. And yeah, that was such good fun. And he is anyone that listens to .NET Rocks will know he's a good storyteller, but he really is in real life. At the lunch breaks and everything, it was just, everyone was just wrapped on what he was saying and just talking about all sorts of stuff. I wish I had his memory.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. I agree with what you were saying about Richard Campbell. He is a walking tower of fascination, I think, is how I would describe him. Just because, in the episode when I talked to him, I can't remember how we got to it, but he was like, yeah, but you got to remember that C# isn't like Perl. Perl is famously a write once, read only language. And I'm like, okay, we have to talk about that. So we went on a journey about Perl, right? And just because he has that breadth of experience, but that also that he's willing to share it. I've met other people in the development industry who are at that level, but will not share any information. And I'm like, well, what's the point of that, right? If somebody asks me for advice, I'm like, I'm going to give you the advice that I've collected. It's not my advice. It's things other people have said. It's things I've picked up in books. It's not Jamie talking to you. I'm showing you the receipt. In this book or in this talk or on this podcast or in this video, this person who is arguably brilliant at what they do has said this. I'm not trying to pass it off as me, right? I'm collecting information. I'm collecting this advice. And so I really appreciate people like Richard who are able to just say, you know what, I'm going to share this thing with you. And, this is how I did it, how I came across it. There's a person in the Tabs and Spaces community who is also in the Coding Blocks community. If you don't listen to that podcast, you totally should, called Jim Hummelstein. He actually retired during this summer, and he started his career before I was born, but started it at Bell Labs, like where they invented Unix and where the C language was created. And like anytime I get to talk to him, he's just like, yeah, let me tell you about this story. Like how he told me a story about how over lunch one day he fixed a bug for Brian Kerrigan, who's one of the grandfathers of C and Unix and, works for Google and things like that. So I'm like, wow, this is fascinating. And he's telling me all this information, but he'll just sit there and just tell it. And that's what I really like. I really like that about our industry, and that it feels like maybe a 75-25 split of people who desperately want to share all their information and people who don't, right? I don't like those knowledge silos, right? I want all the information spread to everyone, because if you keep it in a knowledge silo, that's kind of gatekeeping and stops people from getting in the business, right? Whereas I feel like everybody can do what we do. Well, everyone can do what I do. I don't know about you, but everyone can certainly do what I do.
I think you probably don't give yourself enough credit, though. I think it takes a certain kind of person to, especially in public, and forgetting about doing it in public, whether it's podcasting, YouTubing, or whatever, forgetting about that side. In a company, yes, I've definitely seen both, where you have developers that are, I must hoard the knowledge because that gives me job security and everything. And then developers that are, I will mentor everyone and help and make sure everyone has equal knowledge and understands different bits of the system. And I can tell you which of those two people has the most value to a company. But the first class of developers just don't seem to get that.
Yeah.
But maybe that's part of, I was going to say experience, but to be honest, it's kind of, I see the silo thing in experienced developers as well. But hopefully the kind of people that listen to like podcasts and do all this kind of stuff will know that anyway. So I'm kind of aware that we're kind of quickly running out of time. And given that we both host .NET podcasts, it would be a bit remiss of us not to talk about .NET at all. So in all of .NET, what's your favorite thing about .NET?
Oh my goodness. What I really like about it is, firstly, the developer productivity, but also just that cross-platform ability. Before we hit record, I was telling you about an episode where, at the time, the .NET Core podcast, but now the Modern .NET Show, where the guest and I just talked about how amazing it was at the time to be able for me to write something on my MacBook Air, which was an Intel-based MacBook Air at the time, hit compile or hit .NET Run, and it would run. And then I could copy all of those files, those binary files, over to a Linux machine or a Windows machine and do .NET Run, and it would run, right? I feel like juniors or people with way less experience than you or I, people who haven't gone through those trenches, don't realize how big of a thing that is, right? Because .NET Framework was Windows only for the longest time. And then, Miguel de Icaza came along and came up with this idea of, why don't we make an opaque box re-implementation of it? So I'm not looking at the source code. I'm just looking at when I give this function a 3, it gives me a 7. So it must be doing +4. So I'll write a +4 method or whatever, right? And he went about trying to create a .NET framework for non-Windows devices. And because of Mono, we then got Xamarin. Because of Xamarin, we got Xamarin Forms. Because of Xamarin Forms, we now have .NET MAUI. And because of a couple of splintery things that happened along the way, we also have WPF and Avalonia and Project Uno and Blazor and all of these different technologies that are all spun off from there. And that just is the amount of innovation that's happened due to .NET is just astounding. But the biggest thing for me is productivity with .NET. Like, I tend to spend lots of time in the command line. I can type in .NET, D-O-T-N-E-T space, new space, console, and hit return, and I have everything spun up for me in less than a second. But not just that. It's a single line of code, which is amazing to me as someone who started back in the day, because, Hello World, for instance, in .NET Framework is something like 14 lines of code. Hello World in .NET 6, 7, 8, whatever, is one line of code and a comment, right? And if I'm teaching someone .NET, I no longer have to teach them what a using directive is. I no longer have to teach them what a namespace or a class is, or what public static void main is, or any of that. I can just jump straight to console is the thing you're going to write to. That's this black box. Write line means write this line, and then the parentheses means I'm going to give you something to write. And then it's going to put a new line at the end so that the next time we write something, it's on the next line. Bang, you're a developer straight away, right? 0 to developer in like 4 seconds. And I think that kind of comes from the fact that the folks on the .NET teams and the folks who, like Mads Torgersen, who are looking after the C# language, are looking at other languages and going, what do they do? And can we roll that into ours, or roll a version of that into ours? So like the single line console.writeLine hello world is JavaScript and Python, right? Because that's hello world is a single line in those languages. And so it's astounding to me that they're also looking around for how do we innovate and how do we move forward? Because if you look at like the way that C and C++ and Java have evolved, they've been very slow, and they've been very slow to adopt new things. Okay, you can make the argument for Python as well, because they've only just kind of gotten async await and promises and things like that. But that's because there's a lot of stuff going on there that's not as easy to see, right? But I do like that all of the .NET folks seem to be collaborating with the other languages. What can we do better? What can we do worse? I know that, one of Damien Edwards' personal goals is to be able to produce an ASP.NET Core binary website that is as big as, or rather as small as, a comparable Go binary. And that just boggles my mind that how are they going to do that? Because if you've not played with Go, you can get a web server running in about 8 kilobytes. That's it. But that's his goal, is to sort of match that, meet that with a .NET app. I don't know. I'm just really excited.
Well, each version, performance gets, what's that? Is it Stephen Torb? Is it? I can't.
Yeah.
His blog post about performance. Oh, it's absolutely. I would love to get him on the show. I did actually message him, but he's not seen it, so I don't know whether it is. I'm sure he's very busy. But he's done loads of. One of his blog posts I really liked was the async await, how that really works. So I'd love an episode on just digging deep in that. So if you're listening, Stephen, then give me a shout. You made me laugh before when you were saying about the terminal and typing .NET New, and because you said it in your voice, then that's what your intro in your podcast. So I was just picturing that .NET New. I don't know whether my keyboard came in then, but it's just.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that the .NET New, I know we're running out of time, but I like to tell this little story anyway. The .NET New command in the CLI is literally just a wrapper around templates, right? So you create a JSON file that represents your template. And so the reason that the episodes start with .NET New Podcast is because when it was a monologue, I would do .NET New Podcast and then give it a name, and it would spit out all of the files I need to actually write and record a monologue. So I was literally doing .NET New Podcast at the beginning of every episode, because it doesn't have to be source code. It can be literally anything.
I'm trying to remember. It was a podcast episode or something where you actually said that and went into more detail about it. And I can't remember whether it was one of. I can't remember where I heard that one, but I know there was definitely some, because when you said it, it rang a bell. But yeah, it's quite interesting how you've automated that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, it's the .NET New engine just uses JSON files. So just really quick deep dive on that. The way that it works is you set up a project or a set of files that represents what you want it to look like at the end, and then you add preprocessor directives, which are the hash symbol and then a bunch of things that says like hash replace this with something else, or hash this is the solution name, and then you create a JSON file that you put in that directory that is the template name. And then you put in there things like, this is the key I want to replace. So my arguments might be solution name, and then you put solution name equals, and then $ parentheses the name of the solution or whatever. And then when you do .NET New whatever dash solution, and then put a string, it then knows to replace that in every single file. And so because I did that, I was like, because I built a whole bunch of .NET templates, I was like, can I do it for audio? And it works.
Nice. Automate all the things.
Absolutely.
So before we do wrap up, did you see in the FAQ about the dev tip?
I did. And I think my dev tip for this episode would be to perhaps have a look at what other. Actually, no. So I was going to have two, but my dev tip is be kind to yourself. Right.
That's a good dev tip.
Thanks. One of the things that I've been talking about recently on like LinkedIn and things like that, because it's more of a professional network, I feel like people don't talk about it, especially there, is mental fitness. This is something that Simon Sinek talks about, and he says that he prefers mental fitness to mental health because fitness is something you're actively working on all the time, right? It tends to be that with health, you get to a certain point, you're quite happy, and then you just sort of stay there. Whereas mental fitness requires not a constant, but being able to actually reflect on where am I, what do I need to be, where do I need to go, how do I get around this, and seeing experts about things that maybe you don't like, or maybe if someone listening has got any kind of mental health issues, go see an expert. There's no stigma in that. And over the last year, I've been pushing for people to be kinder to themselves on the different podcasts that I make, because I'm like, I've got this tiny stage. I want to tell people it's okay to go get help, or it's okay to have to get medication. It's okay to have to talk about stuff. And what I did recently was I talked rather openly on LinkedIn about how I go to a support group every Monday. It's a support group here in the UK called Andy's Man Club. And what we do is we all sit around in a circle and we just talk about how our week's been. It's a safe, open space where people can talk semi-anonymously about what's going on with them. And it is called Andy's Man Club, but it is open to anyone who is over the age of 18 and identifies as male. So, if people are transgender or non-binary, then you're accepted too, right? It's not exclusionary in any way, but the idea is that it is seen in Western culture that, men will be sort of, gruff and strong and not worry about what's going on in their heads between their ears. Whereas actually, as much as it is important for anyone to seek any kind of advice or support or whatever, it tends to be that men don't get as much support sometimes because of stigma related to stuff. So my dev tip is to be kinder to yourself and to figure out what it is that helps you to get through the day. So one of my things is I will go and sit in the park. I'll go sit under a tree. Maybe not today because it's pretty bad weather, but I take the headphones off, don't take the phone with me, and I just sit and I listen and I look. And I just be in nature for 5-10 minutes. And it's a Japanese thing called Shinrin-yoku. I'm not saying it with the accent, but I could say it with the accent, but I'm not going to. And that is, it translates as forest bathing. And it is just literally look at the scenery around you and listen to the sounds and the sights and the smells and stuff. And what actually happens is they've proven that in most people, not everyone, but in most people, it boosts your immune response. It releases dopamine and endorphins and things like that are important for brain health. And you actually most people will walk away from it feeling refreshed and feeling sort of, I can get on with my day now. So, if you need it, go sit under a tree for 5 minutes. Because a person that I know who is very important to me once said, there's only one you. So if I turn this around, Dan, there's only one Dan Clark. And without you, there's nothing.
It's the most common name in the world, so there's probably billions of Dan Clarks, to be honest. But I know what you mean. Yeah.
No, but you know what I mean, right? There's only one specific person who is you. And without you looking after you, nothing else can happen. The businesses that you work for or work with won't happen. The MVP status won't happen. The podcast won't happen. The people who love you and live with you, or the people who are friends with you and all that kind of, they can't be friends with you if you are not there. And so looking after yourself physically and mentally is super important to me. But I've talked for way too long about that.
Well, I can definitely link in the show notes because I think on Twitter you mentioned about a LinkedIn article that you wrote, and I read it earlier, which was basically what you were just saying, and I'll link to that in the show notes, make sure that's there. But yeah, it's such an important, I think awareness around this is becoming better, like you're saying that men are seen as like have to be gruff and like can't have, but I think nowadays it's becoming like, I think just awareness about all this kind of stuff is coming better and people are becoming much more understanding, and it reminds me actually on, when was it? It was July this year, actually. You joined us at Oxford for a lightning talk. And what was your title? Important Skills for Developers Empathy. So this kind of like a very similar kind of topic. And that was actually recorded. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well. So we can make sure we get that out there. And so my dev tip is a bit rubbish compared to that important topic. But this is just technology one. If you use Windows and like you're constantly fighting for disk space, which I am all the time, you've probably heard of the tool WinDirstat, which is kind of like, it gives you like a tree and then a graph at the bottom. One problem with this is that it takes forever to scan your hard drive. And someone introduced me recently, I can't remember where it was on Twitter or something, to another tool which does the same thing. It's called WizTree, and it takes like 2 seconds to index your entire hard drive and give you that view. And as someone that's constantly fighting for disk space because I've got various VMs, Docker images being downloaded, video files, audio files for the podcast and YouTube and things, so I'm constantly fighting for disk space. This is absolutely brilliant. So yeah, it's obviously a less important topic than your dev tip, but I just thought I'd mention it.
It's just as important, though. Just as important. If I can as well, I'd like to recommend for folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about mental health and stuff like that. There is a podcast that I listen to, and it gives away a little bit of my personal tastes, called Capes on the Couch, and it's produced by my friend Anthony. And essentially, he role plays a character from a comic book or a graphic novel, and his close friend is a psychologist. And they role play what a therapy session with that character would look like. So they talk about the character first, and they talk about like, Spider-Man's been bitten by a radioactive spider. How would that actually affect his everyday life? How would that affect his ability to connect with people? Would that affect his ability to get healthcare? And then they bring Spider-Man into the therapy session, and Anthony pretends to be that character and puts on a voice and all that kind of stuff, captures all the mannerisms. But then they talk about what a session would be like. So, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, will say, I'm having trouble connecting with my girlfriend. Well, okay, maybe, you need to do this. Maybe you need to do that. And they walk through a therapy session. There is a disclaimer at the beginning in that it's not a therapy session for you, but it gives you an idea of what to expect if you go down the route of going into therapy or counseling or whatever. And it can be really, really eye-opening, and it can help. I've heard from other fans of the show who've said, they did an episode on Homelander from The Boys, and that really helped me deal with X, Y, and Z. So, if I can recommend that, I would recommend it.
Well, I'll definitely include that in the show notes as well. And while we're mentioning podcasts, on a similar topic with understanding yourself a bit better, I'm sure a lot of listeners have heard this already, but the Huberman Labs podcast with Andrew Huberman, that is very, very good. He's goes into neuroscience and goes quite deep with lots of topics like sleep and all of this kind of stuff. It's very, very, very good. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. So we are totally out of time now, but it's been amazing having you on. Where is the best place if listeners do want to reach out to you and ask questions or anything for people to get in touch?
Yeah, sure. So I am on The Bird Place, although that seems to be going down the can at the minute. And we can, I'm happy for folks to take a link to that. If you go to .netcore.show, that will get you to the modern.net show. I do have a new URL for that. I'm just in the process of moving it over and all that kind of stuff. So that will happen eventually. You said, Dan, that you were going to link to the LinkedIn thing. If people want to reach out on there, that's totally fine too. I'm on The Elephant Place. I'm on Mastodon as well. I can link to that too. That's not a problem. But those are kind of the places that I hang out on a lot, is Twitter and LinkedIn and Mastodon. I don't have a huge amount of personal bandwidth for social media, so I don't tend to jump between them a lot. Twitter gets left these days. I'll just log in every maybe couple of days, and it will be login. I don't have the app or anything. Log in, have a look what people are talking about, see if there's anything I can provide, any kind of value, keep up with messages, and then I'll log back out. Whereas, Mastodon I've got on my phone, and I'll occasionally, maybe once every couple of days, open the app and have a look and then just close it, right? I don't have a great deal of personal bandwidth for any of that stuff anymore. So if I don't get back to you straight away, I do apologize, but I will get back to you.
And you're now on the podcast Discord as well, because that's where we're recording.
Absolutely, yeah. So, hit me up on that.
And it's worth mentioning that your podcast also has a Discord, so we can link to that as well.
Yep, .netcore.show/Discord. It'll take you straight there.
Nice. Cool. Well, with that, thank you so much for joining me. It's good to, as you say, flip the bits and do the other way around.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me. I just hope that it's been entertaining and of value to the listeners. That's always my goal, is to try and provide some kind of value and to be a little bit silly and entertaining in some way.
Oh, it's definitely done that, all right. Cool. And thank you, everyone else, for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter or X at Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all the social stuff too. And as I mentioned, we've got a Discord community which is getting bigger, so that's quite cool. So you can reach out to me on there as well. And we'll obviously include links to all the stuff we've mentioned today in the show notes, which is going to be a long list, I have a feeling. That is on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.